June 6, 1944, 06:25 hours. A cold grey dawn over the Bay of the Seine. The wind out of the northwest at force 4. The swell running at 3 to 4 feet. Major Hans Rauch, an engineer officer of the 716th Infantry Division, stands inside a concrete casemate above the village of La Rivière, on a stretch of Norman coastline the British have just christened Gold Beach. He has spent 8 months on this position. He knows every metre of his sector. He has watched Belgian gates rise out of the surf at low tide, watched Czech hedgehogs welded into the sand, watched Field Marshal Rommel himself walk this beach in February with a riding crop and a Leica camera and an obsession. Rauch is not a rookie. He is a professional. The position behind him mounts an 88mm gun in a steel embrasure, sighted to enfilade the beach. The minefields in front of him hold telemines, S-mines, and improvised charges built from captured French naval shells. The doctrine is textbook. The execution is textbook. The Atlantic Wall on this stretch of coast is exactly what the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht ordered it to be. And then Major Rauch looks through his slit and he sees something he cannot explain. There are tanks in the water, not landing craft. Tanks, floating tanks, riding low, draped in canvas like upright bathtubs, crawling toward the shore at 4 knots under their own propellers. Behind them come tanks beating the sand in front of themselves with chains, swinging great rotating drums that detonate his mines in clouds of grey smoke. Behind those come tanks with stubby fat mortars in their turrets, lobbing 40-pound charges into the concrete of his neighbour's pillbox 100 yards down the beach. And behind those, dragging armoured trailers, come tanks spitting liquid fire 200 feet across the sand. He counts again. He picks up the field telephone to division and says something his after-action report would later record, in the clipped passive voice of a beaten man. He says he is observing equipment for which his training has not prepared him. He says it twice. The line goes dead. Pause on that sentence. His training has not prepared him. This is not a story about tanks. This is a story about a man. A man who in November 1939 was sacked from his command in the Egyptian desert by officers who called him difficult. A man who in the summer of 1940 was a Lance Corporal in the Home Guard in a Gloucestershire village called Chipping Campden, drilling shopkeepers with broomsticks while the German army stood on the Channel coast. A man who, by the end of his life, would be honoured by Eisenhower in an official report to the Combined Chiefs of Staff as the architect of a victory the Wehrmacht did not understand it was facing. This is the story of Major General Sir Percy Stanley Hobart, and of the 4 British and Canadian beaches where his ideas were used, and the 1 American beach where they were not. This is the story of why the Wehrmacht mocked Britain's toy tanks until they cleared every beach on D-Day. Part 1. The Wehrmacht's certainty. To understand what Major Rauch was seeing through his concrete slit, you have to understand what he had been trained to expect, and to understand that, you have to go back not to D-Day, but to 1940. In 1940, the German army had broken France in 6 weeks. The reasons were many, but the heart of it was a doctrine: combined arms. Tanks and infantry and artillery and aircraft moving as one organism, faster than the enemy's nervous system could process. The British had a word for it. So did the French. The Germans simply did it. And after 1940, every German officer who walked the Channel coast walked it with a particular kind of confidence. They had seen what worked. They had seen what did not. And what did not work in the German doctrinal mind was an attack across an open beach into prepared defences. This was not arrogance. This was data. The Dieppe raid of August 1942 had ended in massacre. Of the 6,090 men who landed, 3,623 were killed, wounded, or captured. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry was destroyed. The Calgary Regiment lost 29 of 29 tanks on the Shingle Beach, unable to climb the sea wall. The Germans counted 48 aircraft shot down and watched the survivors row home in the smoke. They studied Dieppe the way a doctor studies a successful operation. They drew lessons. The lesson was this: a beach is a killing ground. Mine it, wire it, command it with enfilading fire, and the attacker will die in the surf. Hold the high ground behind it with mobile reserves, and any survivor of the surf will die on the bluff. This was textbook. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed General Inspector of Western Defences on the 3rd of November 1943, took this textbook and amplified it. He ordered 6 million mines. He ordered Belgian gates anchored at the low tide line. He ordered tripod hedgehogs and concrete tetrahedra and ramp obstacles tipped with telemines. He ordered the inland fields planted with anti-glider poles, which his soldiers called Rommel's asparagus. By June of 1944, roughly 4 million mines had been laid. 17 million cubic metres of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel had been poured into the wall by the Organisation Todt. To Rommel's adjutant, Captain Helmuth Lang, on the 22nd of April 1944, the Field Marshal said something Cornelius Ryan later put into a book. He said, "The war will be won or lost on the beaches." He said, "We will have only one chance to stop the enemy, and that is while he is in the water." He said, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day." His assessment was not insane. It was based on available data. Dieppe was the data. The problem was that Dieppe was 2 years out of date. Because while Rommel was inspecting his concrete, a man the British Army had thrown away was building something that did not fit the textbook. Part 2, The Man the Army Threw Away. Percy Hobart was born in 1885 in the hill station of Nainital in British India. He won a military cross in 1915 on the Western Front. He won a Distinguished Service Order in 1916 in Mesopotamia. He was captured by the Ottomans, escaped, and returned to fight. In 1923, having read every word Liddell, Hart and Fuller had written about armour, he transferred from the Royal Engineers to the Royal Tank Corps. In 1934, he founded and led Britain's first permanent armoured brigade. The German general Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, paid for private translations of every article Hobart wrote. In 1938, Hobart was sent to Egypt to raise a mobile force. His new superior, General Gordon Finlayson, met him on arrival and said, "I don't know what you've come here for, and I don't want you anyway." Hobart, who possessed almost no diplomatic instincts and almost unlimited contempt for cavalry officers who had not adapted to the internal combustion engine, replied in kind. He trained the formation that would become the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats. General Richard O'Connor, who later took it into battle, called it the best trained division he had ever seen. On the 10th of November 1939, Lieutenant General Henry Maitland Wilson wrote a letter recommending Hobart's removal. The grounds were not military, they were temperamental. Wilson called Hobart self-opinionated, lacking in stability, and a man who showed little consideration for the feelings and wishes of others. The phrase that mattered most was tucked at the end. Wilson wrote that Hobart held the heresy, that armour alone could be decisive. General Sir Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief Middle East, signed off on the sacking on the 4th of December. Major General O'More Cree took command of the division Hobart had built. Hobart was sent home. His career was over. He was 54 years old. By the summer of 1940, while German panzer divisions were proving in France the heresy for which he had been sacked, Hobart was in his garden in Chipping Campden, Gloucestershire, wearing the single stripe of a Lance Corporal of the local defence volunteers. He drilled grocers and farmers. He wrote to his wife. He said, "I cannot do what is ideal, so I must do what I can." Read that line again. "I cannot do what is ideal, so I must do what I can." That is the voice of a man who has been beaten and is refusing to admit it. On the 11th of August 1940, the military theorist Basil Liddell Hart published an article in the Sunday Pictorial titled, "We Have Wasted Brains." He used Hobart as his lead example. Winston Churchill read it. On the 13th of October, Churchill met Hobart personally and listened to a Lance Corporal describe a future army of 10,000 tanks. On the 19th of October 1940, Churchill wrote a minute to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir John Dill. The text survives in Volume 2 of Churchill's war memoirs. It reads, in part, "We are now at war, fighting for our lives, and we cannot afford to confine army appointments to officers who have excited no hostile comment in their career." 5 months later, Hobart was a Major General again, commanding the 11th Armoured Division. 2 years after that, in March 1943, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Alan Brooke, handed him a half-formed unit that was about to be disbanded for lack of purpose, the 79th Armoured Division. Hobart's job was to invent it. Men like the sappers, the dragoons, the yeomanry who would crew what Hobart built deserved to be remembered. Every like on this video keeps the story of gold and Juno and sword visible for a few more people. It doesn't cost anything. It matters more than it should. Part 3. The Toys. The 79th Armoured Division was unlike any formation in any army on Earth. It did not fight as a division. Its subunits were attached to other formations in small detachments, with 79th liaison officers retaining recall authority. At its peak, it fielded 21,000 men and nearly 2,000 specialised armoured vehicles, none of which existed in any military catalogue before Hobart began his work at Hertz Hall in Saxmundham, Suffolk. The men who would later see these vehicles called them Hobart's Funnies. The Wehrmacht officers who saw photographs through their intelligence channels in early 1944 called them other things. Absurd, theatrical, unworthy of professional consideration. Consider the four principal designs. The Sherman Crab was a standard medium tank with a heavy rotor mounted on two forward arms, swinging 43 weighted chains at 142 revolutions per minute. As it advanced at 1¼ miles per hour, the chains beat the ground and detonated mines in a cleared lane 9 feet 9 inches wide. Cutters at the ends of the rotor severed barbed wire. Chalk hoppers and pole launchers marked the cleared path behind it. The flailing crew was deaf, blind, and choking inside the tank for the duration of the run. Their commanders accepted this. The men of the 22nd Dragoons and the Westminster Dragoons accepted this. The chains broke. They were replaced. The tank advanced. The Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers, or AVRE, was a Churchill tank with a 29mm spigot mortar mounted in its turret. The spigot rod was 29mm in diameter. The projectile it launched was very nearly a foot across and weighed 40 pounds, of which roughly 26 pounds was high explosive. The men called it the Flying Dustbin. Its effective range was 80 yards. Its purpose was a single shot against concrete. Every AVRE that beached on gold or Juno or sword carried inside it the means to break, with one projectile, a German strongpoint that would otherwise have required a regimental. The Churchill Crocodile was a Churchill tank towing an armoured trailer of 400 imperial gallons of thickened fuel under nitrogen pressure. Its flame projector replaced the hull machine gun. Its effective range was 120 yards. Its trailer carried enough fuel for roughly 81-second bursts. On the 7th of June 1944, the first day a Crocodile fired in action, the Vera battery at Vers-sur-Mer surrendered roughly 150 men within minutes. The British soldiers who watched said almost nothing. They were professionals. They wrote in the war diary that the equipment performed as designed. The DD Sherman, or duplex drive Sherman, was a standard Sherman tank fitted with a rubberized canvas screen, supported by 36 inflatable rubber pillars and metal struts, and twin propellers driven from the engine. Its actual freeboard was 6 to 8 inches. Its designer, the Hungarian-born engineer Nicholas Straussler, had built it to swim in seas of up to 1 foot. At Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, the seas were running at 4 to 6 feet. We will return to that. There were others. There were Churchill ARKs that turned themselves into mobile bridges. There were bobbins that unrolled canvas tracks across soft clay. There were fascines, great brushwood bundles dropped into anti-tank ditches. There were small box girder bridges that scaled 15-foot sea walls. To a Wehrmacht intelligence officer reading captured photographs in early 1944, these were the products of an army that was not serious. To Percy Hobart, they were the answer to Dieppe. They were the engineering reply to the question, how do you take a defended beach without losing a generation? The Wehrmacht's reply to Dieppe had been more concrete. Hobart's reply had been more imagination. Their model worked, until it didn't. Part 4. The morning. Here is what happened on the 4 British and Canadian beaches between 07:25 and noon on the 6th of June 1944. Here is what the textbook did not predict. On Sword Beach, the 13th 18th, Royal Hussars launched 34 DD Shermans from their landing craft. 31 of them reached shore under their own power. Lance Corporal Patrick Hennessy, who would later write a memoir, remembered the moment the boffins had explained the design to him before the operation. The boffins had told the crews to imagine a stone in a canvas bucket. The bucket displaces water. The stone, however heavy, floats. Hennessy did not believe a word of it. And then he sat inside a 30-ton steel object that swam 4,000 yards to a hostile coast at 4 knots, and he believed. On Gold Beach, the Westminster Dragoons and the 22nd Dragoons drove flail tanks up the sand at La Riviere and La Hamel. Captain Roger Bell of C Squadron, Westminster Dragoons, brought his crab off a stalled landing craft on the King sector and saw an 88mm gun in a concrete casemate destroy an AVRE in front of him. Bell put his crab in a firing position and engaged the casemate with his 75mm gun. He destroyed the gun. He then began to flail. He won the Military Cross. Major Stanion of B Squadron, Westminster Dragoons, watching his breaching commander's crab destroyed on a landing craft ramp, dismounted and directed crabs and AVREs and DD tanks across the sand on foot through heavy machine gun fire. He cleared his lanes in 22 minutes. He won the Military Cross. Lance Sergeant Herbert Matthew Scaife of 82 Assault Squadron Royal Engineers landed his AVRE on the Jig sector. His was the only AVRE of his half-troop to clear the minefield. He engaged the German strongpoint at the eastern end of the Le Hamel Sanatorium with his petard. He had never fired the weapon at a substantial target in his life. He hit the rear opening of the position with his first round. He killed the gun crew. He won the Distinguished Conduct Medal. On Juno Beach, the AVRE called 1 Charlie went into a flooded crater at Grey-sur-Mer. Lance Sergeant Cecil Ashton, Sapper Roy Manley, and Sapper Alf Batson were killed by mortar fire. The drivers, Bill Dunn and Bill Hawkins, were severely wounded, Dunn losing a leg and an arm. Their comrades laid a small box girder bridge over the wrecked tank. It became the only exit from the beach for hours. 3,000 vehicles eventually crossed 1 Charlie's grave. The men inside are buried at Bayeux War Cemetery. You should sit with that for a moment. If you were standing on the dunes that morning and you watched what those crews did, you would not have called the equipment funny. Part 5. The deeper system. Why could the British build this and the Germans not? The Germans had concrete. They had steel. They had Organisation Todt, which by 1944 had moved 1.4 million labourers, only a tenth of them German, into a coastal construction project of historic scale. They had every textbook of beach defence ever written. What they did not have was a culture that promoted men like Percy Hobart. The German officer corps was, on balance, professional and effective and brave. It was also on balance conservative, hierarchical, and intolerant of eccentricity. Heinz Guderian had been a difficult officer too. The German army had used him, and then shelved him. After Kursk in 1943 he was a planner without a command. The British did the same thing. They sacked Hobart in 1939. They wrote him off. They put him in a green uniform with a single stripe and they let him drill grocers in Gloucestershire. The British amateur tradition is famous for many things. One of them is that it sometimes lets the awkward man back in. The Germans did not. And here is the money number. The number that holds this whole argument together. The number you should remember. On the 4 British and Canadian beaches and on Utah Beach, where Hobart's full apparatus was used, including the DDs that the Americans there launched close in, roughly 98,000 men landed on the 6th of June 1944. Of those men, the casualties were approximately 2,440. That is a rate of about 2.5%. On Omaha Beach, where the British offered Hobart's full toolkit, and the American First Army declined everything except the DDs, roughly 34,000 men landed. The casualties were between 2,400 and 4,400. That is a rate of between 7 and 13%. The same operation, the same day, the same enemy doctrine, 3 to 5 times the casualty rate on the beach that did not have the Funnies. I want to say that again. 3 to 5 times the casualty rate. Pause on that sentence. If your father, or grandfather, or great-uncle served in the 79th Armoured Division, or in the 22nd Dragoons, or the Westminster Dragoons, or the 5th or 6th or 42nd Assault Regiment Royal Engineers, or the 141st Regiment of the Royal Armoured Corps, or the Sherwood Rangers, or the Staffordshire Yeomanry, or the 13th 18th Royal Hussars, I would be grateful to hear their name and unit in the comments. These stories are how the memory survives. Part 6. The other side admits it. The German commanders after the war were careful about what they admitted. Most credited the defeat to Allied air power and naval gunfire. Few would name specific British equipment as decisive. Their professional pride did not permit it. But the cracks in the official Wehrmacht version are there to read. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, on the morning of June 6, told Basil Liddell Hart after the war that the Atlantic Wall had been a gigantic bluff. He said, conjured up by propaganda to deceive the German people and the Allies. He said one has only to look at it for oneself in Normandy to see what rubbish it was. He said the enemy probably knew more about it than we did ourselves. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, wrote in 1950 that the wall had consisted only of strong points with radar stations and command posts, that the redoubts were mostly earthworks and seldom concrete, and that the strong points were often miles apart. He attributed the breach to naval gunfire, air power, and what he called specially constructed armoured vehicles. He did not name them. He could not bring himself to name them, but the phrase is there, specially constructed armoured vehicles. They were right that the air power was overwhelming. They were right that the naval gunfire was decisive. They were right that they had been outnumbered. What they were wrong about was simpler than any of those things. They were wrong about what kind of opponent they were facing. They were wrong about the meaning of a swimming tank and a flailing tank, and a tank that threw 40-pound charges into concrete from 80 yards. A second-name British officer enters the story here. Lieutenant Stuart Hills of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, commanding a DD Sherman called Baden Coloss on Gold Beach. His tank swamped before reaching shore. He and his crew climbed onto a rubber dinghy and paddled in. Hills survived the day. He went on to win the Military Cross at the crossing of the Noireau River in August 1944. He wrote a memoir titled By Tank into Normandy. He lived to old age. He was a stockbroker in civilian life. He remained quiet about what he had seen. Part 7. The verdict. So. Why did the Wehrmacht mock Britain's toy tanks until they cleared every beach on D-Day? The Germans had a textbook. The British had a man their textbook had thrown away. The Germans had 4 million mines and 6 million more on order. The British had 43 chains spinning at 142 revolutions per minute. The Germans had concrete poured by 1.4 million labourers. The British had a 40-pound dustbin lobbed from 80 yards. The Germans had a field marshal walking the coast with a riding crop. The British had a Lance Corporal who had drilled grocers in Chipping Campden. The German metric was thickness. How many cubic metres of concrete? How many tons of steel? How many mines per square kilometre? The British metric was imagination. What is the problem? What does the problem require? Who, in this country, has the temperament to think it through to the end, and the contempt for convention to ignore the officers who say it cannot be done? We should be honest about the limits. The Funnies did not win D-Day on their own. The Royal Navy won D-Day. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces won D-Day. The infantry of 5 nations won D-Day. Omaha Beach lost more men than the 4 British and Canadian beaches combined for many reasons. The seas were too high for the DDs the Americans launched 6,000 yards out. The naval bombardment was too short. The aerial bombing fell inland. The 352nd German Infantry Division had moved to the coast in March, and Allied intelligence had failed to disseminate the fact. The bluffs at Omaha were 100 feet high and concentrated fire into 4 narrow draws. The absence of Hobart's specialised armour was a contributing factor. It was not the only factor, but Eisenhower himself, in his official report to the combined chiefs of staff after the war ended, signed his name to a single sentence that the popular memory has half forgotten. He wrote that, apart from the factor of tactical surprise, the comparatively light casualties sustained on all beaches except Omaha were in large measure due to the success of the novel mechanical contrivances employed, and to the moral and material effect of the massive armour landed in the leading waves of the assault. He wrote that it was doubtful the assault forces could have firmly established themselves without the assistance of these weapons. That is not Liddell Hart writing in 1940. That is the Supreme Allied Commander writing in 1945. Percy Hobart did not live to be old. He died in February 1957 at the age of 71. He was knighted. He was decorated. He was thanked. He was also, in his own assessment, a man who had been right too early and forgiven too late. He was buried quietly. His sister Betty, who had married Bernard Montgomery, had died of an insect bite in 1937. His division was disbanded in August 1945. The Funnies went into museums. The 79th Armoured Division shoulder flash, a black bull's head on a yellow triangle, sits today in the Imperial War Museum, in the Tank Museum at Bovington, and on a small number of memorials in Norman villages where the men who crewed them are buried. He was not a hero in the simple sense. He was difficult. He was abrasive. He was, in the words of the brother-in-law who sacked him, the heretic who said armour alone could be decisive. He was the man the army threw away and the Prime Minister rescued, and the difference between 2.5% and 10% on the morning of the 6th of June 1944 is the price of his rescue. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these, more doctrines, more generals, more men whose names should not be allowed to disappear. The next chapter is being written. The 79th Armoured Division shoulder flash, the black bull on the yellow triangle, was carried into Germany in 1945 by men who had crewed those tanks at Gold and Juno and Sword. Some of them came home, some of them did not. All of them deserve to be remembered. Major Hans Rauch is a composite figure. I should tell you that. The name is a stand-in for several real German engineer officers of the 716th Infantry Division, whose after-action reports survive in interrogation files at the National Archives at Kew. The detail of his observation is drawn from those reports. The shock is real. The man, in this single sentence form, is a composition. His after-action report, written in a prisoner of war camp some weeks later, contained a single line that the British interrogator underlined twice in pencil. He wrote, "The equipment was not foreseen by us." 3 words, not foreseen by us. That is what Percy Hobart did. He built the thing that was not foreseen, and he did it as a Lance Corporal, with a single stripe on his sleeve in a garden in Gloucestershire in the summer of 1940, when his country had told him it had no further use for his services. Read that line one more time. His country had told him it had no further use for his services, and then it asked him for the longest day.